Hi, I'm Nathan Smith, Nathan Smith Photography, coming to you from Pisa, Italy. Here today to talk about auto ISO on the Fuji cameras and how to use it, especially the new auto shutter speed feature that is inside of auto ISO. I've done a little testing and I'd like to share my findings with you. So first of all, why use auto ISO? Well, the beautiful thing about the auto ISO on the Fuji cameras, and I still have one of my 3 X-T1s, and what I discovered is that the auto ISO will always select the lowest ISO for the lighting conditions and the settings that you have set it at, something that you would do anyway. The beautiful thing is if you're outside shooting and you walk into, say, a dark church or something, the auto ISO will automatically move the ISO to the lowest possible ISO for those conditions. And when you come back outside, you're not shooting at 6400 ISO still. So it works extremely well. First of all, for those who may own a camera that only has one auto ISO setting, what I used to do with my X-T1 was I would set it up with a maximum ISO of 6400, a minimum ISO of 200, because I always shoot RAW plus a small or medium JPEG. And then I would set my minimum shutter speed to about 1/30th of a second, which I can handhold most lenses pretty stably at 1/30th of a second. The problem is that sometimes the camera will, because it tries to give you the lowest possible ISO, often if things get a little bit dark, it will immediately go to your lowest selected shutter speed. And so while I am able to hand hold a camera at 1/30th of a second, I may not always want to. I would prefer, for example, for the ISO to be 400 or 800 and maybe use a shutter speed of 125th or 250th rather than shoot at 1/30th of a second to get that ISO 200. So one thing that you can do with all of your Fuji cameras, and it's very easy, and I guess I should preface this by saying that today when I'm talking about auto ISO, I think most professional photographers are probably shooting, if they're not shooting in manual mode. And by the way, you can use auto ISO in manual mode. You can select the shutter speed that you want, the aperture you want, and the auto ISO will automatically select the lowest possible ISO for the shutter speed and aperture that you have selected given the lighting conditions that you are in. Okay? But if you shoot aperture priority, which is what I do, and I have to make a little statement here. I know there's a lot of photographers out there, I see this all over Facebook, where people say, I only shoot manual. Well, yeah, that's wonderful. My first camera was an Olympus OM1, and it was completely manual. There was an on-off switch, and it was a wonderful camera, and I shot with that for probably a good 5-6 years. And it was a great learning camera. The next camera that I had was an OM2, which had manual plus aperture priority automatic. Most creative photographers usually will want to pick their aperture to control depth of field. And then normally if you're shooting manual, you select the corresponding shutter speed that sets your exposure according to the meter at 0. Well, in aperture priority, you're just letting the camera do that second step for you. So you're no less of a photographer if you're shooting in aperture priority. In fact, if you're at a wedding, for example, and let's say the room light is constant, and many people would say, well, I shoot in manual because the lighting is constant. Yes, but if you suddenly want to open up 2 stops, for example, then you also have to quadruple your shutter speed to keep the same exposure. And then when you stop it down because you want a little more depth of field, you correspondingly have to slow down your shutter speed. In aperture priority, I simply turn my aperture ring and open it up, and the camera automatically does the second part for me. And then when I decide I need more depth of field, I turn my aperture ring again, and the camera automatically gives me the corresponding shutter speed. And Fuji, on all the Fuji cameras, at least the better models, did include this wonderful thing called an exposure compensation knob. So if you, as a professional, say, yeah, this needs to stop more light, you turn it to +1. Or maybe you've got front lighting at a concert, and maybe you want to stop it down a stop or two to get a proper exposure. So using aperture priority with the exposure compensation will get you the same results in most cases as manual. Obviously, if you're shooting in a studio situation, then where the lighting is perfectly constant and you've decided on a particular aperture, then manual may work better for you. Also at a wedding, if I've selected a spot where I'm going to do all the family formals, the lighting is constant, I know I'm going to shoot everything maybe at f5, 6, or 8 to make sure I have everybody in focus, then yes, selecting manual to lock in that exposure so that light subjects like the bride with her white dress and all the light colored bridesmaids won't give me a different exposure than when all the groomsmen step in front of the camera with their dark suits. Okay, but so assuming that we're shooting in aperture priority and using auto ISO, if you have done what I said where you select, for example, a low shutter speed of a 30th of a second as your minimum, and maybe all of a sudden you're like, you know what, I really need a higher shutter speed. You could go into the menu and change it, but a much easier thing to do is just simply grab your shutter dial and turn it to the shutter speed that you want. Your camera will show the M symbol showing that you're, quote, shooting in manual, but you actually are still shooting in an automatic mode as your ISO will automatically adjust to the lowest possible ISO and you will get that shutter speed. And then when you get back into, let's say, normal lighting and you trust the auto ISO completely, you can put that shutter dial back on A and keep shooting. Now, the X-Pro2 and the X-T2 both have 3 slots for your auto ISO settings. And I did a prior video, which is here, where I explained what I recommend where you can set that up on a function button. And I've talked to some people that say that they set it up on their top button. And there's another prominent author out there who has said he sets it up on the left button. And those can work fine, but I'll tell you why I strongly recommend using the right function button to set up your auto ISO. By doing that, the camera will function the logical way that the menus on the camera function. On almost any kind of camera, when you get into your menu, you normally move, you move to the right to get into the menu, and to get further in the menu, move to the right again, and to back out, you move left. So setting it on the right function button follows this logic. So what I do, if I'm shooting and I suddenly need to change my auto ISO, I simply press the right button, and you can see here I have auto 1, 2, and 3. And I call these settings day, dusk, and evening, and I'll explain here in a moment what that means. So on auto 1, for example, I have that set to a minimum default sensitivity of 200, a max sensitivity of 800, and a minimum shutter speed of like a 400th of a second. Okay. Now the other advantage, while I'm on this, the other advantage of using the right button is you can hit it and you can select one of your 3 slots. But if you suddenly look at that and say, you know what, I need to change that, you hit the right button again, just like you do on the menu button, and you can go right in and change that quickly and easily. Now the reason that my bright light or auto 1 setting, I set a higher minimum shutter speed, because in bright light, let's say I'm here in Italy and I walk into an alleyway and it gets darker, maybe I would rather shoot at a 2/50th or a 400th of a second rather than, and have my ISO go to 400 or 600 rather than have it drop to a 30th of a second. So for, general bright light conditions, normal conditions, those are my settings. My second setting is kind of a low light situation. Maybe you're shooting a bride getting ready and inside. It's not dark, but it's getting darker. On that, I set the default sensitivity to about 320. I'm willing to go up to 3200 ISO on that. And I set my minimum shutter speed at like 100th of a second. The final setting is like your super low light setting. And on that, I actually start at ISO 800. The reason that I don't start at 200 is because I want my shutter speed, if possible, to be not at the absolute lowest shutter speed. So by setting a higher default ISO, it will give you a little faster shutter speed, and I'm willing to have that. The max, I do take it all the way up to 12,800. And then and only on my super low light setting do I set it the minimum shutter speed to auto. And let me talk for a minute about that. What that does is your minimum shutter speed will change with the focal length of the lens. And Fuji in their manual says that this will be the focal length of the lens. But actually in my testing, what I have found is that it is actually 1.5 times the focal length of the lens. All right, so, well, for the majority of the lenses. So for example, my 23mm lens, the shutter speed is a 34th of a second. At 27, it's 40. At 35, it's 52. So basically, at my 56, it's 85. So basically, the minimum shutter speed is what the equivalent full frame focal length lens is. So that's what the shutter speed is. For those of you that have done photography a while, you've heard of the focal length rule for setting your minimum shutter speed. Now, interestingly enough, I don't own the 16mm lens, but I do have the 16-55. And I have contacted people, and he has a 16mm lens, and he told me that the shutter speed on auto is a 20th of a second, which I was a little surprised because it really should be about a 24th, 25th of a second. On my 16-55, if I shoot at 16, it is a 20th of a second. If I shoot at 16.5 millimeters, it does go to a 1/25th. But the problem is on a 16mm prime, you can't move it to 16.5. So just be aware of that if you shoot with a 16. On the zoom lenses, I found the rule applies. And at 100 millimeters, it's 150th of a second. At 200, it's 280. And at 400, it goes to 800. So it does work. Now, this is really, really important to anyone out there using auto ISO. Fuji, whatever your maximum ISO is set to, is sacred. Whatever your minimum ISO is sacred. Whatever you set for aperture or shutter speed on the dials is sacred. But if you are shooting in aperture priority mode and the lighting is dimmer than to get in other words, you are not going to get a proper exposure based on your settings, the camera will drop your shutter speed below what you have set the minimum shutter speed to. So, for example, when I tested the auto shutter speed control in auto ISO, I had to make sure that my ISO was somewhere in between the two settings that I set it to. So be very aware of that. And the shutter speed doesn't show up in red or orange. There's no indication other than, well, seeing the shutter speed. But if you're not paying attention, you may end up with a shutter speed that is too low to hand hold. There was someone on Facebook, and this is kind of what started this video, who was disappointed because she took photos and they were blurry because her shutter speed dropped down to a 20th of a second, even though she had set a higher shutter speed. So be aware of that. But if you use auto ISO, and it can be a great tool. And like I say, if you use the right, directional button, you can very quickly change it. You can either hit OK, or you can just tap your shutter button to get out of it. So it's, as we would say in Italy, it's super veloce. Hope this has been helpful. Just to reiterate from my other video, I do set my top button for bracketing to change the bracketing mode. Now, one thing I didn't put into the other video is if you are on the X-T2, you can only change the bracketing when your dial is set to bracketing. On the X-Pro2, that's not necessary. The other thing that I do on all my Fuji cameras is the front button here. I use that to set the depth of field preview. And the wonderful thing about it, and I keep forgetting to use it, is on my Nikon, for example, it wasn't a very useful tool, because if you were shooting at 8 or f11 and you push the button, suddenly the viewfinder got so dark you could barely see what was going on, and so I rarely used it. It was almost easier to take a photo and examine it on the back of the screen. But the great thing about the Fuji cameras with the mirrorless technology is when you push that button and change your aperture, you can see and control exactly how much depth of field, and the screen of course remains bright and beautiful, and you get a perfect exposure. One last tip I want to share, and I got this from the Angry Photographer, got to give him credit for this. One thing I missed when I shot Fuji, and this is only on the X-Pro2 and X-T2, it might be on the X-T20, I don't know, because I don't have that camera. It's not on the X-T1, but if you want to format your card quickly, I used to miss on the Nikon. I could hold down 2 buttons and then it would say FOR, and then you would release and hold them down again and it would quickly format the card. With your X-T2 and X-Pro2, if you hold down the trash icon, and you have to hold it for about 3 seconds, and then press the rear command dial, it comes up with the formatting menu, so you don't have to go into your menus to find formatting. So again, hold down the trash icon for about 3 seconds, and then while holding it down, hit your rear command dial and you can format your card. Hope this has been helpful. Have a great day. Ciao.